She was 34 years old, and by the fall of 1889, she owned nothing but the coat on her back and a tin box of letters. The Larkspur County Bank had taken her family's homestead that August, and the man who signed the papers was Silas Cobb, a loan officer who had smiled the whole time he did it. What little money she had left after selling her horse and her mother's silver came to $11.40. It was not enough for a room, let alone a future. So when she heard the bank was also auctioning off a ruined sawmill on the edge of town, the old Jernigan mill, shuttered for 6 years, its roof caved in on one side, she did something everyone in Larkspur Hollow called foolish. She spent every last dollar she had, $11 even, to buy it outright. Cobb himself laughed as he handed her the deed. Nobody could have guessed that somewhere inside those rotting walls, sealed away and waiting, sat a secret that would not just save her, it would settle a debt the whole town didn't know it was owed. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Odessa Hale. If you've ever been counted out before anyone gave you a real chance, you'll know this feeling. Consider subscribing to keep these stories coming and tell us where you're watching from. Here's where it began. Odessa Hale grew up on a wheat farm 11 miles outside Larkspur Hollow, a scrap of a town pressed against the foothills of the Wyoming Territory, where the wind never quite stopped moving and the winters came early. Her father, Ambrose Hale, was not a rich man, but he was a careful one, and he raised her the way he ran his farm, with patience and with an insistence that nothing be wasted. He taught her to read a ledger before she could properly read a novel. He taught her that a broken tool was not a dead tool, only a tool waiting on a steady hand. Her mother, Ruth, had come from a family of seamstresses in Ohio, and from her Odessa learned the quieter arts, how to mend, how to listen, how to notice the small torn places in a life before they became large ones. Together her parents gave her something sturdier than money, the conviction that value did not always announce itself loudly, and that the things people threw away were rarely as worthless as they looked. Odessa was an only child, and so she grew up doing work that would have gone to a son in most other families, hauling feed, mending fence line, sitting beside her father at the kitchen table while he squared the farm's accounts by lamplight each Sunday. He never once told her that any of it was beyond her. He would set the ledger in front of her and say, plainly, "Numbers don't care who's holding the pencil, Odessa, only whether the pencil tells the truth." She carried that line with her the rest of her life. Her mother taught her differently, but toward the same end. An evening spent letting down a hem or turning a worn collar was not drudgery to Ruth Hale, but a kind of quiet correction, proof that a thing did not have to be thrown away simply because it had begun to fail. Odessa grew up, in short, in a household that measured worth by attention rather than appearance, and it shaped how she saw everything afterward, from a torn coat to a person the town had already decided to stop looking at twice. She married young, to a gentle, unlucky man named Thomas Hale, no relation by blood, a coincidence of surnames that had made her father laugh at the wedding, and for 11 years they worked the farm together. Thomas was not a farmer by instinct. He loved machines, gears, the insides of things, and he spent long evenings out in the barn fixing neighbors' plows and pumps for whatever they could spare in trade, often refusing payment altogether from families who had little to spare. Odessa kept the books, and where Thomas gave his labor away too freely, she was the one who quietly made certain the household still balanced at the end of each month. She learned early that a marriage, like a farm, survived on the same principle her father had taught her: nothing wasted, everything mended, everyone accounted for. In the evenings, After chores, Thomas would sometimes bring in some ruined piece of machinery a neighbor had given up on, a seized pump, a cracked axle, and set it on the kitchen table like a puzzle, and the two of them would work it apart together, by lamplight, until it ran again. They had no children, a private grief they carried together and rarely spoke of, but they had each other, and for a long while that felt like more than enough. Then came the winter of 1886, the one old-timers in that country still call the Big Die-Up, when snow fell for weeks without pause and cattle froze standing in the open fields. Thomas caught a fever going out in that weather to save a neighbor's herd, and he did not recover. Odessa buried him in March, in ground still hard with frost, and stood at the grave alone, because her parents had passed years before. She was 29, a widow, and the farm was hers, but a farm without a second pair of hands, in a country that unforgiving was a slow kind of drowning. She held on for 3 more years. She sold off land in pieces, first the north acreage, then the good grazing near the creek, each sale a little more of her father's life sold out from under his memory. She hired a boy from town 2 days a week to help with what she could no longer manage alone, and paid him more than she could truly afford, because she remembered what her father used to say about honest work, deserving honest wages. She took in mending work from town too, the very skill her mother had given her, stitching late by lamplight until her eyes ached, walking 2 miles each way to deliver finished garments because she had already sold the wagon horse. Neighbors were kind in the way frontier neighbors often were, a sack of flour left on the step, an offer to help with the harvest, but kindness could not service a banknote, and everyone in Larkspur Hollow understood that plainly enough not to pretend otherwise. It was not enough. The bank had extended credit against the farm years before, in Thomas's name, and when the note came due in the summer of 1889, Odessa did not have it. Silas Cobb rode out himself to deliver the notice, sitting tall on a horse too fine for a loan officer, and told her, not unkindly in tone, but entirely without mercy in substance, that the bank would be taking the property within the month. She asked for more time. He said the decision had already been made above him. She would learn much later that this was a lie, that Cobb had pushed the foreclosure through personally because he had his own designs on land near the creek, water rights that would matter a great deal once the railroad spur came through. But in that moment she knew none of it. She only knew that within 4 weeks she had nowhere left to stand. She left with a wagon, 1 trunk, her father's ledgers, and Thomas's toolbox, because some habits outlast the reasons for them. She took a room above the mercantile in town, paid for with the last of the farm sale, and she watched, with a strange numb clarity, as her life narrowed down to almost nothing. It was in that narrowed state, walking past the courthouse steps one gray September morning, that she saw the notice posted for the county's foreclosure auction, 3 properties, sold as is, cash only, no warranties given. The 3rd listing caught her eye, only because she recognized the name. The old Jernigan Sawmill, abandoned since 1883, when its owner, a widower named Amos Jernigan, had vanished from Larkspur Hollow without so much as a farewell to the men who worked for him. The bank wanted it gone. Minimum bid, $11. She stood in that thin crowd on auction day with her $11.40 wrapped in a handkerchief, watching men who owned proper businesses shake their heads at the mill and walk away. Nobody wanted it. The roof had failed on the east side. The mill pond had silted in. It was, by every sensible measure, worthless. And so when the auctioneer, with visible amusement, asked if anyone would take it off the county's hands for the opening bid, Odessa lifted her hand before she had fully decided to. Cobb was there, standing near the courthouse steps in his fine coat, and he laughed out loud when he saw whose hand it was. "The Hale woman's bought herself a barn full of splinters," he said to the man beside him, loud enough for her to hear. "She paid her $11. She signed for a building nobody else would touch, and she told herself, walking the half-mile out to see it for the first time as its owner, that at least a ruin was hers, when nothing else in the world was." The mill sat quiet and grey against the tree line, its big water wheel frozen with rust, its loading dock sagging toward the creek. Inside, dust lay thick over everything Amos Jernigan had left behind, ledgers gone soft with damp, a coat still hanging on a peg, as if he meant to return for it any day. Odessa walked the floor slowly, testing boards with her boot the way her father had taught her, and found, to her quiet relief, that the frame itself was sound. It was neglect that had ruined it, not rot, neglect, and time, and a roof nobody had climbed up to fix in 6 years. She spent that first week simply clearing debris, sweeping years of pine needles and mouse nests from the corners, patching what she could with Thomas's old tools. It was on the 4th day, working loose a section of wall paneling in the old office that had swollen and buckled with damp, that her crowbar caught on something that was not wood. Beneath the warped outer board sat a second panel, fitted with care, deliberately hidden, a false wall, built into the framing itself. Her hand stopped on the latch. She didn't breathe. Not yet. She pried it open slowly, half expecting nothing but more rot. Instead, her lamplight fell across a metal strongbox, and beside it, wrapped in oilcloth to keep off the damp, a stack of ledgers and letters bound with twine. She sat on the dusty floor of that ruined office for a long while before she touched anything else, feeling the strange, private weight of having found something a man had gone to real trouble to hide. The strongbox held money, not a fortune in the way of stolen gold or buried outlaw loot, but a substantial, sober sum, the kind a careful man puts away over years. Wrapped with the coins was a short letter, addressed to no one in particular, dated the week before Amos Jernigan disappeared. In it, he explained himself in a shaking hand. He had run the mill honestly for 18 years, he wrote, but in his final seasons the bank, the very same Larkspur County Bank, under a different manager back then, had begun pressuring him to sell his water rights along the creek, rights that would become valuable the moment the railroad came through the valley, as everyone in town now quietly expected it soon would. When he refused, the bank called in older debts, small ones he had let slide as a favor to it years before, and threatened to seize the mill outright unless he signed the water rights over for almost nothing. Rather than surrender them, or fight a bank with more lawyers than he could ever afford, Amos Jernigan had done something almost nobody expected. He had spent months quietly withholding a portion of the mill's earnings from the bank's demands, setting the money aside, along with every ledger, proving what the bank had tried to do to him, and to at least 2 other landholders along that same creek, whose names he listed by hand. He meant, he wrote, to bring the ledgers before a circuit judge the following spring, but he never got the chance. His letter ended mid-sentence, as though something or someone had interrupted him before he could finish it, and by the following week he was gone from Larkspur Hollow for good, and nobody had ever learned why or where. Odessa read that unfinished letter 3 times by lamplight, and slowly the shape of it settled over her like cold water. This was not simply a treasure, it was evidence, proof, carefully documented, of a bank that had been quietly stealing water rights from struggling landholders along that creek for years, dressed up each time as an ordinary foreclosure. The same creek that ran along her own family's old property, the same bank, now run in Silas Cobb's generation, that had just taken her home under circumstances she was beginning to understand were not so different from Amos Jernigan's at all. There is an old truth among people who build things with their hands. A structure only ever fails at its load-bearing points, the places nobody thinks to look at because the wallpaper covers them so well. A house can look sound for years, while the one beam holding the whole frame together quietly gives way behind the plaster. What Odessa held in her lap that night was exactly that kind of beam, not decoration, not treasure for its own sake, but the one hidden thing actually holding up the truth of what her town had been standing on for years without knowing it. What looks worthless to a crowd in a hurry to walk past it is very often the one thing worth the most to a person willing to kneel down and look closely. Word spread faster than she expected that the Hale woman had found something out at the old mill. She had told no one but the postmaster, asking quietly about how to reach a circuit judge, and yet within a week Silas Cobb himself rode out to the mill, no longer laughing. He offered to buy the property back from her, on the spot, for 4 times what she had paid, an absurd sum for a ruin, and both of them knew it. When she declined, his tone changed. He reminded her, with the particular calm of a man used to being obeyed, that the bank still held paper on half the businesses in Larkspur Hollow, and that a woman alone, new to owning property, might find herself facing complications she hadn't anticipated, a tax reassessment perhaps, or trouble renewing her water permit for the mill's own pond. It was not quite a threat. It was worse, because it was true, and they both knew the bank had the power to make good on it. That night someone, never proven, never confessed to, but never much doubted either, set fire to the mill's loading dock, a clear warning that stopped short of destroying the evidence itself, as though whoever sent it still hoped she might simply hand it over quietly instead. She stood in the dark, watching the last of the flames die against the wet boards, and for one long moment she considered simply walking away, taking whatever price Cobb offered, and starting over somewhere the bank had no reach at all. It would have been the sensible choice. It would also, she understood, have left Amos Jernigan's name buried a second time, and left the 2 families along the creek exactly where the bank had always intended them to stay. She did not sleep that night. She sat up with Thomas's toolbox and Amos Jernigan's ledgers spread across her knees, and she understood, with total clarity, that she had exactly one chance to do this right, and that Cobb would not wait long to try something worse. She spent the next 2 weeks moving carefully. She made 3 complete copies of the ledgers by hand, in her own handwriting, matched against Jernigan's original entries, working nights so no one would see the lamp burning. She sent 1 copy by mail to a circuit judge 2 counties over, a man with no ties to Larkspur County at all, along with a plain letter explaining what she'd found. She gave a 2nd copy, quietly, to the 2 other landholders Jernigan had named in his letter, families who had lost creekfront acreage to the same bank under strikingly similar circumstances, and who listened to her with the stunned, slow-dawning anger of people finally being handed the truth about their own lives. And she kept the original, along with the strongbox itself, hidden somewhere Silas Cobb would never think to look, in the false wall itself, resealed exactly as Amos Jernigan had left it, because she had learned, if nothing else, that a hiding place already proven to work rarely needs improving. The circuit judge arrived in Larkspur Hollow on a cold morning in November, and what followed was not the sort of dramatic reckoning found in dime novels. No shouting, no gunfight, nothing so simple. It was slower, and in its way, more thorough. An examination of the bank's own foreclosure records, compared line by line against Jernigan's ledgers, revealed a pattern impossible to explain away as coincidence. 3 separate landholders along that creek, over 11 years, foreclosed on for modest debts, just as the bank quietly acquired their water rights below market value. Silas Cobb had not personally engineered the earliest cases, those predated him, but he had continued the pattern without hesitation once he inherited the position, including, the judge found, in the handling of Odessa's own foreclosure that summer. The bank was ordered to return the disputed water rights to the original families or their heirs, Odessa Hale chief among them, and to pay restitution drawn from its own reserves. Cobb himself was removed from his position within the month, his name quietly attached to the affair in every ledger the county now kept, in a town small enough that quiet ruin travels just as far as loud ruin ever could. Odessa did not use Amos Jernigan's money to enrich herself, though nobody in Larkspur Hollow would have begrudged her that. Instead, she used it to rebuild the mill properly, a new roof, a repaired wheel, machinery bought second-hand and fixed by her own hands, the way Thomas had taught her, and she reopened it not as her private business alone, but as a cooperative mill, where the very families Jernigan had once tried to protect could bring their timber and grain and pay only what the work actually cost. She hired 2 of Amos Jernigan's original mill hands, old men by then, who wept a little the first morning the wheel turned again after 6 silent years. And when the railroad spur did finally come through the valley the following spring, exactly as Jernigan had predicted, it was the returned water rights, not the bank's, not Cobb's, that determined who profited from it, and that profit was shared, deliberately and by Odessa's own insistence, among every family the old scheme had once wronged. She kept Amos Jernigan's unfinished letter framed on the mill office wall, in the same room where she'd found it, not as decoration, but as a kind of accounting, a reminder, the way her father's ledgers had always been, that nothing true stays hidden forever, if someone is patient enough to look. When people asked her, in the years after, how a woman with $11 to her name had ended up rebuilding half the water rights in the valley, she would only say that she hadn't found a fortune in those walls. She'd found an unfinished debt and finished paying it, to a dead man's memory, to 2 families who'd nearly given up hope of ever being believed, and to herself, 34 years old, and counted for nothing, standing in a ruin nobody else would touch. That was the story of Odessa Hale, the woman the bank laughed at, who bought a barn full of splinters and left it a mill that ran honest for the rest of her life. Real justice, in the end, rarely looks like punishment alone. It looks like a wheel turning again, after years of silence, like a family getting back water that was always rightfully theirs, like the next overlooked person in line being treated better simply because someone before them refused to let the old pattern continue unchecked. Quiet power is not measured by what it takes down. It's measured by what it builds back up and who gets to stand on solid ground because of it. If this one landed for you, pass it along, subscribe to catch what's next, and let us know where in the world you're listening from. What is a time you found value in something others wrote off? Until next time, stay close.